Thank you for joining us. I'm Major General Retired Paul Friedrichs, and I'm very excited to be joined today by David Senior, the Senior Vice President at Cencora, and we are here to talk about the rapidly evolving dependence that the United States has on pharmaceuticals and their ingredients produced in other countries, both the risks and the opportunities that creates.
This is the CommonHealth podcast, a product of the CSIS Bipartisan Alliance for Global Health Security. We engage with diverse leaders on the question of how best to navigate this period of exceptional turmoil, reform, and uncertainty in U.S. leadership.
Well, David, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see you again, and excited to have this discussion with you and with our audience. Maybe you could start framing all of this with a little bit about Cencora's more than 100-year history working in the pharmaceutical industry, and then how you became a part of the Cencora team and your role.
Sure, Paul. It's really my pleasure to be here today. So the history of the corporation does go back about 100 years. The industry, the wholesale drug industry in the United States probably goes back to 150 to 175 years, believe it or not. But the Cencora businesses were roll-ups that started roughly about 100 years ago and consolidated over time. I think the importance of that is it really demonstrates we've been at this a long time, and we know our business. We've continued to refine it, and we continue to get better today. In the last 25 years, I'd say roughly 25 years, we've expanded beyond just being a drug wholesaler in the United States. We've moved into other ancillary businesses in the pharmaceutical space, whether it's related to helping support clinical trials through logistics and other commercialization services. Packaging, support for our customers, both upstream and downstream. And I think for this conversation, what probably is most significant is about 5 years ago, we bought a distributor who had a presence in 11 European countries. So now we have, we have other businesses that have offices globally, but the wholesale distribution business, we've got, in a heavy European presence. My history doesn't go back 100 years, but it does go back 25 years with the corporation. I came in the year 2000, so it spent 35 years in healthcare, but 25 of that at Cencora, starting as the leader of the strategy function. Then I was led the finance function for our wholesale business in the U.S. In the last 7 years, I've served essentially as kind of like the chief economist of the company, trying to figure out how this supply chain works and how to make it better. Partially for our company, but partially just to make the entire system work better.
Well, and that's a great segue into the next question, because the more that I and many others have gotten involved in this, the more confusing and complex it is as you seek to understand the supply chain. And, just as framing, with your global presence, you get to see not just the domestic supply chain that so many people are concerned about here in the United States, but also how these supply chains are linked around the world. And also the difference between generic supply chains and those for the brand name pharmaceuticals. I think one of the really interesting parts of this for me is the pharmaceutical industry is one of those industries where we're seeing, as we have in other spaces, a transition of manufacturing and research and development from the United States to other countries, and that creates vulnerabilities for us. As you look at your global experience, going back 100 years, and in your case, 25 years there, are there best practices or lessons learned or things that you all have seen with some of your international partners that can help inform what we should be thinking about when we look at our domestic supply chains?
Sure. So it's really been a fragmented global marketplace in terms of the downstream to the customer bases. I know the manufacturers have moved to consolidation in different regions of the world, and we can talk about where and why those have taken place. I remember when our corporation first went to India to source generic drugs. It was roughly 2005, 2006. And what's interesting about that is there were some international suppliers were already in the U.S. We were maybe a few years late to the game. And what's so interesting about that, and going to get to your international question. But what's so interesting about that is, so that was 2005, 2006, 2011 it was the peak of drug shortages. So this dealing with an international landscape is something that I don't know if those two facts are correlated or not, but certainly as we're talking today, 15 years later, 20 years later, it's like, wow, okay, there's got to be something that's linked between the two. What we saw during COVID and how different markets are trying to figure it out is that I guess what I said, Paul, is each country is dealing with drug shortages today. The drug shortages, it's not just a U.S. problem, it's a global problem for different reasons, but similar reasons. Whether it's, the pressure on manufacturers to reduce their costs, maintain their quality, pressure on reimbursement, and lack of visibility of supply chains. And, what things look like from the finished goods to the active pharmaceutical ingredients to key starting materials. These are not unique challenges that the U.S. has. I think different countries are moving at different paces, or different parts of the world, I should say, are moving at different paces to solve this. And what we've seen in Europe, for instance, is a pretty significant acceleration of activities to act as one unified body since COVID. Before COVID, it was what we saw was different definitions of shortages in every country, different supplies, no coordination and consistency really, and they've been on a journey similar to what I remember when the first seminal shortage report came out from FDA in 2019 here. They essentially had a similar report a few years ago and started moving in directions towards how do we solve this? How do we bring some manufacturing back? How do we drive some consistency? How do we collaborate and partner across the different countries? And leading to the introduction of the Critical Medicines Act this year at the EU, which is intended to be a unifying source of solutions. The thing that was interesting that I think is perhaps different than what we've done here is they started with a pilot with 11 products, and they said, okay, let's go down the formulary route, figure out which products have the most risk, and let's study these and try to figure out, try to nail down what it takes. We all know it's drug shortages are the result, and weak fragility of the supply chain is multifactorial. But let's study it with 11 different products, and that preceded their approach to coming up with a grand strategy. A couple other markets I talk about, Japan, people think about that as an advanced market. It is. Guess what? They've got drug shortages like us. They've got quality issues in their market, despite having some level of domestic supply. I think South Korea is one of the more interesting countries to study.
I would agree.
Yeah, because, and I think the data speaks for itself that they have fewer shortages than other places. Now, they have the benefit of a lot of supply or manufacturing coming out of their country. So guess what? They have what we talk about, which is having supply on the ground, capacity on the ground. But they also do a lot of things in terms of truly tracking the data in the supply chain, what's happening, where are the weaknesses, et cetera. And they also have a mechanism so that drug prices do go up or reimbursement goes up, and manufacturers can essentially apply to have increases in reimbursement, and many of the times it works. And so some of the things I think we're going to talk about and have been talking about in the U.S., we see some level of success. But I think Korea is a bit of an outlier because of their robust manufacturing capacity.
Well, thanks, David. I'm smiling as you're going through all of that because I was part of some of those discussions in my last job. And what was striking was they've moved from talking to action. Yeah. And, I'll share my personal opinion that, and I'm not going to put you on the spot with this, but, we're still in the talking phase. We had some initial action that we've taken, but that's part of the opportunity that I think this discussion highlights is the time for action is now. And other countries have shown that taking action actually does result in reducing some of their vulnerabilities and improving availability of drugs. Cencora spent a lot of time thinking about this. I mean, you've had to because of your global presence and because of the diversity of your product lines there. Can you share a little bit about how you all are envisioning what this could look like or what solutions could look like? Yeah,
happy to. And I think that I'll I'll sort of comment about your statement, we're not taking action. I think where you have seen action, I mean, you see action here and there, but where you've seen action is in the commercial solutions space. And there are specific things that our corporation is doing, others are doing to sort of solve things on a one-by-one basis. I would agree with you; those are not systematic solutions, and that's what we're lacking in the United States.
And if I could jump in on that, I mean, we actually did systematic solutions. You mentioned COVID earlier. We had the supply chain control tower at one point that was helping us to track a whole host of shortages. It's not that we don't know how to do this or that we've never done it before. We just haven't codified it and, as you said, made it an enterprise or a healthcare-wide industry approach that incorporates all of those players that we partnered with during the pandemic. So you're right. I should have been more precise in my description there.
Well, and your comment about the supply chain control tower is a great one because when in thinking about the solutions, whether they're short-term, intermediate-term, long-term, to creating more resilience in the supply chain, data and understanding of what's going on in the supply chain is critical. And we have a long way to go. We are making progress, but that's foundational, and it's not the solution. Data is data. Data is not product. So.
Yeah, and and I'll go back to your comment about the EU. As they've described their work, that's what they started with, was a clear understanding of supply chains. And I'll say that it was incredibly frustrating in prior jobs when we tried to understand our domestic supply chains, and we're basically told we don't know. We think that a lot of it comes from here or from there. There's, as you mentioned, a great deal of consolidation. But that is a first step, and I'll give a shout out to U.S. Pharmacopoeia. They were great partners as we were trying to look at specific drugs. We actually followed the European model, picked 5 drugs, and started to look at them. And it was very surprising where you found the real choke points and the vulnerabilities going forward. But with that mindset of looking at the supply chains and choke points and vulnerabilities and doing something about them, could you say a bit more about what Cencora is doing right now?
Sure. So one thing we are doing, and we think there are bigger, broader policy solutions, are more sustainable contracting. And so we will, for particular products in particular circumstances, we will sign long-term committed contracts. Now, I want to clarify. So we're a distributor, and this is an important thing to know. The majority of what we supply to our customers is product selections that the customers have chosen. We haven't chosen. So we do source a material portion, but it's a smaller fraction of the entire mix. So but for those products where we're doing the sourcing, we are increasingly trying to move where it makes sense, where we see the most risk to shortages, to signing more committed level contracts. But those are early days, and those are risky for us. Generic drugs are commodity products where the customers, the market operates as if these are commodities, and there's significant fluctuations of products price. And costs, depending on how many manufacturers are in a product or whatnot. But I think this idea of sustainable contracting is a key. Now, if you start thinking about systematic solutions around that, the problem with that is that the reimbursement systems don't work that way. Reimbursement doesn't recognize and reward for sustainable contracting. So what manufacturers really want to have effective operations is that committed volume, those committed contracts. But that starts not just with the people like us, the distributor, but sort of the customers at large need to be rewarded for being willing to commit to long-term contracts for commodity products. So that's step one.
Well, there's a lot that you packed into that answer, David. So let's unpack that just a little bit. So, a part of what you touched on, and which I hope is clear to many of the folks who are listening to this, is just how complex all of this is, because you've got the companies that produce the key starting materials, which are then used to produce the active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are then combined in a way that gives you the core drug substance, which are then packaged, which are then labeled, which are then distributed, and then are by a pharmacist given out either to a patient or to an office. And all of those have to be playing together for the market to work efficiently and effectively. And you've described the fact that Cencora plays a role in multiple parts of that very complex supply chain there. But I think it was surprising to me, at least, to realize that as complex as all of that is, for so many drugs, when you got all the way down to the beginning there's just a handful of places where those key starting materials or those active pharmaceutical ingredients come from. And that creates a real vulnerability that if, as China has done with rare earth magnets or other substances, if someone who controls that supply decides not to make it available, it's not, because they control it.
Right.
And that is from my perspective, a real national security risk. But then as we go forward in the supply chain, you talked about the linkages and the complexity of those other pieces, and you said something that I think is really interesting. If we want to talk about a market-driven economy, a market-driven pharmaceutical industry here, there's got to be a market. And what some countries have done masterfully is when we reach a price point at which domestic manufacturing is feasible, they'll lower their price until the domestic manufacturing shuts down because everybody's gone to the lowest priced option. So as you look at that vulnerability and you talk about these sustainable contracts or these long-term contracts, what does that mean in the pharmaceutical industry? What is it, a 6-month contract for a couple of pills? Is it a 60-year contract? What can you help us all understand what that actually means?
Yeah, I mean, those are so. I think the idea in a programmatic solution that if the government were willing to step in and figure out a way to reimburse and drive higher reimbursement to reward that, you can have longer contracts. I mean, yes, we do have some contracts that are more than a year. Let me just put it that way, where we've committed. But this is new. This is really new for us, and I think the customers are getting used to signing agreeing to those types of arrangements as well. We have over the last 4 or 5 years introduced programs for our customers where we're committing to certain prices with them, and they are signing agreements with us. And increasingly, those types of arrangements, you talk about our sweet spot, and distribution is carrying additional inventory and essentially cycling through that inventory, perpetually keeping it fresh. The concept during COVID was that that product would sit on the shelf and expire. Programs that are taking place in the commercial market don't work that way. We typically, for our programs, we're carrying 6 months of inventory that customers are essentially willing to pay, what we term insurance for, to assure themselves that they have product. And I'm going to hit one topic that. I said something about different definitions of shortages. So, I know there's a lot of data out there that says the average shortage is 2 years, 3 years, whatever. We don't see that. We see a lot of shortages that are shorter. We see a lot of shortages that actually never make it in terms of, near misses, I would call. The worst shortage we've seen in the last few years was the cancer drugs in 2023. And, as devastating as that was, it was 6 months. And guess what? We knew about it ahead of time, and we knew it ended ahead of time based on other definitions of shortages. So we're strong believers that having additional inventory in the supply chain, we're carrying the cost of that. We think that, again, there are systematic approaches. There are government solutions that are out there, whether it's paying hospitals or others to carry the inventory, and they'd probably have to rely on somebody like us to carry it for them, or a direct program between the channel, whether it's manufacturers or distributors, to carry additional inventory, and those types of programs funded by the government. But again, all of this costs money. But it's a relatively inexpensive way versus some of the longer term solutions. It's less expensive and can be done quicker. We think of that as sort of the intermediate term solution versus, I think, as you were mentioning, actually bringing manufacturing back to the U.S.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute, because that there's this push that we're going to bring it all back and we're going to make it all again in the United States. Do we need to produce everything here, or is there an opportunity to partner? I mean, you guys spend your life collaborating with all the different players in the supply chain across multiple countries. Is this such a global enterprise now that there's an opportunity to collaborate with some of the countries that you mentioned, the members of the European Union and Japan and Korea. We had started to explore that at one point, and it seemed that there was real interest in, and as their governments are investing in manufacturing, from your perspective, is there value in replicating that in multiple countries, or given the finite amount of resources available, are those partnerships, and especially public-private partnerships, a part of the solution?
We do think public-private partnerships are a part of the solution. We think that tax incentives for additional manufacturing in the U.S. are key. Whether it's to build new plants, to reopen plants, to expand facilities, those are things that without government support, it's going to be hard for manufacturers to get confident in what they're doing. We talked before about the risk for a generics manufacturer wanting to bring product back to the U.S. The problem they have is that they don't have committed demand. I wouldn't say branded manufacturers have committed demand, but they have patients who are on chronic therapy, and they have physicians who are used to prescribing their drugs. Generics, it's different. They're subject to the risks of commodity marketplace, because that's how we pay for drugs. So to bring the industry back, there has to be some level of support and an encouragement to do so. But it's going to be a long-term endeavor. In terms of your question about the global countries, I think I think there's obviously reckoning going on right now in terms of what needs to be here. But I guess thinking back to what we said about Europe, which is, okay, let's start with the most critical drugs and figure out, let's start there. Let's try some things out, and we would think, we agree that pharmaceuticals are a national security issue as much as anything else. There's quality risks, there's price volatility, but national security is something to be concerned. And I think your question about does it have to be in the U.S. or elsewhere, those are answers for someone else to come up with.
Well, and that's a very fair response. And as someone who spent my life in the national security enterprise, and in particular in the health space, I would say it's a national security issue. If people can no longer get their chemotherapeutic treatments for their cancer, or they can't get the drugs that they need for their blood pressure, or they can't get any number of other drugs, that quickly becomes an economic issue because of the ripple effect of those drugs not being available. And it becomes a personal health issue for that patient and their families who have to watch their loved one not be able to get the treatment that should be available for them. And so I would say it's all of the above as we go forward. Let's look forward to the future just a little bit. As we've talked a lot about some really concerning aspects of where we are with the supply chain and the need for changes. But there's also some pretty exciting things happening out there. This confluence of rapidly increasing computational capabilities, rapidly evolving biotechnological capabilities, and then AI and what it can offer to bring those two together in new and exciting ways. It seems to have us on the cusp, and we're actually now seeing some novel therapeutics coming forward that really were science fiction even 5 years ago. Does that, in your mind, offer some opportunities that we should be thinking about to help rethink supply chains?
I think it absolutely does, and I agree with your premise that we're on the cusp. It is quite amazing to see what's coming, and in some respects, I think it's coming at the perfect time. the emergence of those technologies and the what's becoming a fairly rapid adoption of advanced computational mechanisms, advanced AI, as well as biotech. The thing that gives me some excitement about it, in fact, is that a lot of us in the pharmaceutical world are concerned about how society is going to pay for drugs, and one direction is, boy, we just can't afford to continue to innovate and come up with new drugs. We as a society can't afford it. But you think about all those technologies, in particular AI and let's call it quantum computational work, which is coming at some point. The the R&D, those R&D capabilities aren't specific to the pharmaceutical industry. Right. They're used for all kinds of industries, and so they're not going to slow down just because of something taking place that is pressuring the pharmaceutical space. So I think the technology is going to continue to advance. But I think at the same time, there's a reason that roughly 20% of R&D in the world, at least in the U.S., is spent on pharmaceuticals. It's a huge industry and huge opportunity for improving human life, and the fact that R&D broadly is going to be continued to be used for healthcare is really incredible. And so I think that, like I said, I think it's coming at the right time because we're having this reckoning about cost. And I think the technology is coming at the right time to do things differently, more efficiently, more quickly, and come up with so many more products than ever before.
So, let's stay on the optimistic theme here, because if you envision this world in which this confluence of technologies allows us not to try and rebuild what existed in the United States 20 years ago, or what to some extent still exists in Korea and a few other countries today, but instead think, what do we need in 2030? What does that look like from your perspective?
I think it's what we talked about all along here, which is that there's a lot of amazing things taking place in the world of R&D, technology. Whether it's AI. Everybody's using AI today, and just in 1 year, how much things have changed. But I think you started this conversation with the time's now, and it really does feel like the time is now to take a systematic approach, at a national level, and have some reckoning about what's the right way to harness what's right in front of us in a way that's going to advance things on a population basis, not just specific winners and losers. And because, look, the market works really well. I'm a capitalist, and I believe in, companies doing everything they can to advance their cause as well as broader causes. But sometimes you need the role of government, and this is one of those times where we need government to step in as well and supplement all of the things that the private market is doing.
Well, David, I want to thank you for that optimistic note. As we get close to the end here, I'll say that it has been public-private partnerships. I mean, if you go back and you look across the history of the pharmaceutical industry, at critical moments, there has been that partnership where, we chose to work together in order to save lives, in order to ensure that grandmother had access to the drugs that she needed, or somebody's kid had access to what they needed. And so I'm excited to hear how you describe that and that you see that as a plausible way forward. I'll make the observation that, as we're in this moment in time thinking about budgets for next year and what right looks like, it is a little perplexing to envision a 60% cut in the National Science Foundation budget, 45% cut in the NIH budget. These large reductions don't seem likely to improve the amount of research that's available, and that does create even greater risk that the next innovations will be occurring somewhere else. If we pull back from our historic leadership role in research in this space, I think what you described and what others have talked about creates an even greater risk. But if we continue to do what this country has done for 100 years or more, as you said, in the pharmaceutical industry, which is that partnership where the U.S. government invests in a lot of the early stage research, industry picks it up and brings it to the reality of my grandmother gets what she needs. It's worked so well, and hopefully we can help that discussion going forward. So thank you very much for being here with us today, and thanks to all of you who are listening to this. Hope that this was a helpful description, both of the challenges of the pharmaceutical supply chain, but also the fact that we are at this really exciting inflection point with some tremendous opportunities to rethink what a 21st century supply chain looks like, and how it makes sure that our families have what they need next year and in 5 years and 20 years down the road. Thank you very much. Have a great day.